Imagine waking up in a world with no markets, roads, cities, farms, or any certainty about your next meal. Everything your family will eat depends on what you can find, hunt, fish, or gather that day. Now imagine that, at some distant point in time, someone looks at a small plant sprouting near the camp and notices something that will change human history forever. That plant grew exactly where a few seeds had fallen months earlier. It was through simple observations accumulated over many generations that our ancestors began to transform the relationship between human beings and nature. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and join us on this journey into the past, because today we are going to understand how groups of hunters and gatherers took the first steps toward agriculture, a change so profound that it opened the way for villages, cities, governments, trade, and entire civilizations. But there is an important question from the very beginning. Was agriculture a great planned invention, or did it emerge slowly, almost without people realizing what was happening? Tell us what you think in the comments. The answer revealed by archaeology is more interesting than the idea of a single inventor. Agriculture was not born in one day, in one place, or through one person's decision. It appeared gradually in different regions of the world as human communities began to interfere more and more with the natural life cycles of plants. For most of human existence, our ancestors lived by hunting, fishing, and gathering. They possessed an extremely detailed knowledge of the environments around them. They knew in which season certain fruits ripened, where animals gathered, which roots were safe to eat, which leaves could be used as medicine, and which seeds were dangerous. The image of primitive humans wandering around without knowledge is misleading. Survival required people to observe the weather, memorize landscapes, interpret tracks, and understand hundreds of species. These groups generally moved throughout the year as resources became available. That does not mean they were always wandering without a destination. Many communities repeatedly returned to the same rivers, valleys, and forests. During certain seasons, they stayed for weeks or months in places where food was abundant. These seasonal camps were important because they allowed people to live near particular plants for longer periods and created the conditions for practices that gradually began to resemble cultivation. When people gathered wild grains, fruits, nuts, and seeds, some of that material inevitably fell near their camps. Certain seeds were discarded with food scraps. Others were exposed to fire, ground into flour, or placed in storage. After the rains, plants sometimes began growing in areas where they had not been common before. Observant humans probably noticed the connection between a seed, the soil, water, and the appearance of a new plant. That realization does not mean someone immediately created a farm. The first step may have been far more subtle. People could have cleared vegetation around useful plants, driven away animals, watered young shoots during dry periods, or scattered seeds in favorable locations. They may also have burned small areas because fire removed older vegetation, released nutrients, and encouraged the growth of desirable species. These practices were early forms of environmental management, positioned somewhere between gathering and agriculture as we understand it today. Another decisive factor was the changing climate after the end of the last ice age. About 12,000 years ago, the climate became more stable in many regions and in numerous places warmer. New landscapes formed, and certain grain-producing plants spread more widely. In the region known as the Fertile Crescent, a broad area that includes parts of the modern Middle East, human communities found wild wheat and barley growing in abundance. For a time, people could harvest these grains without deliberately planting them. Some groups began to remain longer in these resource-rich environments. They built sturdier homes, made grinding stones, and dug storage pits. Storing food profoundly changed daily life. When a community saves grain for the future, it must protect the supply from moisture, insects, rodents, and other human groups. It must also organize consumption, decide who controls the reserve, and remain close to the storage area. Food storage therefore encouraged a more settled way of life even before agriculture was fully established. Sedentary life created new opportunities and new problems. The longer people stayed in one place, the easier it became to observe the entire life cycle of a plant, from germination to seed production. They could compare which seed heads were larger, which grains tasted better, and which plants survived cold weather or water shortages. By saving part of the harvest for the next growing period, they began to select particular traits even though they had no knowledge of genetics. This process is known as domestication. It did not happen only because humans changed plants. Plants also changed human life. In the case of grains, gatherers favored seed heads that did not break apart easily because they were simpler to harvest and carry. By collecting and replanting seeds from those plants, communities increased generation after generation the presence of crops with larger seeds that remained attached to the stalk. Over the course of centuries, some varieties became so different from their wild ancestors that they came to depend on human cultivation to reproduce efficiently. Agriculture, then, did not begin when someone drew perfect rows in the soil. It began within a long transitional zone. First, people gathered plants. Then they protected particular species. Next, they scattered seeds, cleared land, replanted the best varieties, and organized harvests. For a very long time, the same community could cultivate a few grains while still depending heavily on hunting, fishing, and gathering. The change was gradual, uneven, and filled with experimentation. There was also no single agricultural center for the entire planet. At different times, communities in distant regions domesticated local species. In East Asia, rice and millet became important. In New Guinea, humans managed plants such as taro and bananas. In Africa, sorghum, pearl millet, and other species were cultivated. In Mesoamerica, corn emerged through the transformation of a wild grass known as teosinte. In the Andes, potatoes, quinoa, and other foods became essential. In parts of North America, local plants were also domesticated before corn became dominant. This shows that agriculture was not a body of knowledge created by one civilization and handed to everyone else. It arose independently whenever certain conditions came together: detailed environmental knowledge, the presence of suitable plants, climate changes, population growth, long-term residence in a territory, and the need to make food supplies more predictable. Not all these factors appeared everywhere, and that is why different peoples follow different paths. People often imagine that hunters and gatherers immediately abandoned their old way of life after discovering planting, In reality, early agriculture could require more labor and produce worse health. Farming meant preparing the land, planting seeds, removing weeds, protecting crops, harvesting, carrying the produce, and storing it. A drought, flood, or pest outbreak could destroy months of work. In addition, dependence on a small number of foods reduced dietary variety and increased the risk of nutritional deficiencies. Why then did people continue? Agriculture offered one powerful advantage: the ability to produce a large amount of food in a relatively small area. Even if the life of each individual did not immediately become easier, cultivation could support larger populations. More children survived in settled communities, and the number of inhabitants increased. With more people to feed, returning completely to hunting and gathering became increasingly difficult. Society was moving on to a new path. The growth of villages encouraged the development of tools. Simple hoes made from stone, wood, or bone helped loosen the soil. Sickles fitted with small stone blades made it easier to cut grain. Mortars, pestles, and grinding stones turned grain into flour. Baskets, pottery vessels, and storage buildings protected food. In some regions, channels began carrying water to the fields. Each solution increased productivity and deepened people's dependence on cultivation. Agriculture also changed the human understanding of time. Hunters often had to make decisions in response to the immediate movement of animals and rapid environmental changes. Farmers needed to think months ahead. A seed planted today would not produce food until much later. People had to remember the rainy season, anticipate cold weather, observe the phases of the moon or other natural signs, and reserve food for periods when nothing could be harvested. Planning, calendars, and tradition became even more important. The relationship with land changed as well. Mobile groups used large territories, but they rarely needed to mark every small piece of ground. When a family invested labor in clearing, planting, and irrigating a field, that location acquired a new value. Disputes arose over fertile areas, water sources, and stored supplies. The concept of ownership became stronger, although it varied widely among societies. In some cases, land belonged to the community. In others, families or leaders gained greater control. Agricultural surplus brought another decisive transformation. When a community produced more food than it needed for immediate consumption, some people could devote more time to other activities. Certain individuals specialized in making tools, building houses, producing pottery, weaving, trading, or organizing rituals. This did not happen all at once, but it gradually created more complex societies with a deeper division of labor and wider exchange networks. Surplus, however, could also create inequality. Those who controlled granaries, irrigation canals, or fertile land possessed power over others. Leaders could demand a share of the harvest in exchange for protection, organization, or access to water. Over time, some villages grew, became regional centers, and many centuries later, gave rise to cities and states. Agriculture did not automatically create civilization, but it provided a material foundation for the concentration of population and political power. It is important to understand that this history was not an inevitable march toward progress. In many places, communities experimented with cultivation and later reduced or abandoned it. Others combined agriculture, herding, fishing, and gathering for thousands of years. Some hunter-gatherer societies maintained stable, sophisticated ways of life that were well suited to their environments. Agriculture was one strategy among many, not proof of superior intelligence. We should also avoid imagining that the first farmers understood the full consequences of their choices. A family scattering seeds near its home was not planning the rise of empires. It simply wanted to improve the chances of finding food during the next season. A community building a storehouse did not intend to create taxes or social classes. It was trying to survive winter, drought, or a period of scarcity. Major historical transformations often begin with small, practical decisions. Perhaps one of the most important scenes in this transformation occurred countless times. A woman or a man selected the fullest grains, separated them from the smaller ones, and saved them for the next planting. Children learned by watching adults. Elders remembered which areas had produced the best harvest the previous year. Someone noticed that a plant grew better near water. Another person observed that the soil became more fertile after burning. This knowledge traveled through speech, demonstration, and experience. Across generations, cultivation stopped being only a supplementary experiment and became the center of life in many communities. Houses were built closer together. Fields began to surround villages. Paths connected growing areas, water sources, and storage sites. Ceremonies came to accompany planting and harvesting because survival depended on those stages. Seeds came to represent not only food, but also continuity, hope, and the future. The beginning of agriculture was therefore a silent revolution. There was no single moment when humanity woke up as a farming species. There were thousands of observations, mistakes, droughts, harvests, saved seeds, and lessons passed forward. There were choices made by people who did not know words such as domestication, genetics, or productivity, but who understood the behavior of the plants around them in remarkable detail. And that may be the most impressive part of the story. Agriculture emerged before written science, before cities, and before governments. It was developed by communities capable of experimenting, comparing results, and preserving knowledge over many generations. A cultivated field became a kind of open-air laboratory where humans and plants changed together. Today, almost everything we place on a table carries traces of that distant past. Bread, rice, corn, potatoes, beans, fruits, and many other foods are the result of selection accumulated over thousands of years. Every modern seed contains a history of adaptation, labor, and observation that began with anonymous people. When we ask how primitive humans began agricultural activity, the most accurate answer is not simply that they planted a seed. They observed nature, recognized patterns, modified the environment, chose varieties, stored food, and taught what they had learned. Agriculture began when humanity stopped only searching for useful plants and started consciously participating in their life cycles. This transformation brought security and risk, abundance and inequality, growth and new diseases, cooperation and conflict. It made large populations, specialized occupations, and cities possible, but it also demanded intense labor and created forms of dependence that had never existed before. It was not a simple story of improvement. It was a complex change that redefined our species. The next time you see a cultivated field, remember that it represents a partnership built over thousands of years. Behind every row of plants lies the memory of ancient communities that learned to wait for the rain, protect the soil, and save seeds for a future they could not predict. And now we want to hear your opinion. What was agriculture's greatest consequence for humanity? The creation of cities, the increase in population, or the rise of inequality? Write your answer in the comments. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about the major transformations of the past, and share this video with anyone who enjoys discovering how seemingly simple decisions changed the course of human history.